Welcome to the Asia Federalism Dialogue. As many of you know, the Asia Federalism Dialogue is organized by the Hans Seidel Foundation with the aim of bringing conversation on the topics related to federalism. The conversation is designed in a way that it captures public policy and its implementation in some of the Asian countries that are either federal, semi-federal, or feature some characteristics to that of federalism. My name is Dr. Thaneshwar Bhusal. I am from Nepal. With this introduction, I would like to welcome to Professor Tayao in this series of conversation. Professor Tayao is currently the Executive Director of the premier non-governmental organization working on local governance in the Philippines and even in the region. The Local Government Development Foundation, that is known as the entity over there. In addition to his internationally recognized expertise in the issues of participation of non-governmental actors in decision making, I would like to highlight his special contribution to the review of the existing constitution with the sole aim to propose reforms toward federalist constitution in the Philippines. Professor Tayao chaired 2 of the 9 subcommittees, the formation of federal regions subcommittees and the powers of federal regions subcommittees, the very heart of the proposed federalist forms of the government in the Philippines. He is currently invited as a key expert for the government preparation to implement the landmark Supreme Court Mandanas Garcia ruling, redefining the determination of the shares of local government from national revenues. Today's discussion is on about the participation of non-governmental actors in decision making in different types of government. But our focus, of course, is on how federal countries or semi-federal countries have been reworking in recent times to revitalize the participatory platforms for non-governmental actors. So, Professor Tayao, I would like to welcome you to this series, and I would like to begin by asking a simple question about your impression on how participation of non-governmental actors in decision-making has become such an interesting topic in federal or semi-federal countries, or even countries like the Philippines. What would you say about it?
Thank you, Dr. Bhusal, especially for that kind introduction. Let me say first that developing countries like the Philippines have taken a different direction in terms of political development. Of course, whenever we speak about political participation, whichever structural design, whether it's in a federal or in a unitary form of government, the public participation is always dependent on the kind of political development. Having said that, we here in the Philippines are still trying to further enhance and capacitate non-government organizations' participation in governance, particularly at the local level. At the national level, I'd like to think that civil society participation or non-governmental participation is more advanced. But at the local level, precisely because of the kind of politics that we have, it's really requiring so much more capacitation and development. A shift from the current very unitary form of government to a federal form and extending the already decentralized structure of public administration as is supposedly provided by our laws would certainly help in further developing or enhancing public participation, particularly with non-government organizations.
Yes, that's very intellectual, so to speak, an in-depth analysis of how different forms of government have actually thought of, including the participation of civil society actors or organization in some formal expression. So my own reading says, Professor Tayao, is that there is a growing disconnection between what is deliberated within the community of civil society actors or non-governmental actors and how decisions are made. Many unitary type of governments specific to this concern are somehow criticized for not providing adequate spaces for those deliberations. Whereas in federal countries, although the research is still in its infancy, to come to the conclusion about whether federal countries are better in connecting the deliberation within the civil society actors. Considering your own background on proposing the reform agenda in the Philippines context, what would you say about how governments can actually, tighten the breeze between the actual decision makers and those who actually play at the fora of civil society organizations or non-governmental actors?
I can only agree with your observation, Dr. Bhusal. That's why in my introduction, I mentioned that at the national level, the participation of civil society and or non-governmental organizations is far more advanced. At the local level, I cannot deny that local politics is very personal to the point that political power is limited, still limited for so many years, I think, with particular political families. And this is the reason why, in terms of decision making, in terms of policy determination, it's very difficult to have non-governmental organizations substantially engage local governments. The reason why I agree with you that federal democracies are far equipped, better equipped in accommodating non-government organizations' participation or political participation for that matter is because it somehow redirects local governments from a very limited perspective to a broader perspective. In the Philippines, it's unfortunate that we have a very fragmented local governments. We have very small local governments. Our municipalities are only as big as villages in other countries. Our provinces, which are supposedly equivalent to or similar to state governments in other countries, are also very small and comparable only to the size of municipal governments. So in terms of policy making and in terms of policy implementation, there is always a problem, especially if you're talking of issues which defies political boundaries, like as simple as traffic management, waste management, or disaster risk reduction. So if we look into the context of the Philippines, certainly there are challenges that remains as far as political participation.
Absolutely, I fully agree with you, Professor Tayao. You brought two very interesting angles to this conversation. One is, where does it actually happen when it comes to the participation of non-governmental actors? You mentioned that federal or provincial governments may have limited space compared to the local governments, because local governments are those who actually work on day-to-day basis with those civil society organizations and the like. And you also brought an issue of policy, in which policy area the decision makers at different levels in the hierarchy of the government are actually interested in offering participatory opportunities to non-governmental actors. This is quite interesting. So do you have any observation about the possibility of limiting the participatory opportunity at the national level? I would visualize that, for example, national security policies may have limited space for ordinary people to participate in. Whereas, for example, you also highlighted at the local level that the waste management policy making can be one of the avenues in which we can offer participatory opportunities to people who belong to civil society organizations or the non-governmental organizations. So how can we balance this contradiction or paradox to offer, on one hand, participatory opportunities to people on the policy making, while on the other hand, to maintain the dignity, the, how should I call it, let's say, the gravity of the policy matter in this regard?
Okay, let me start with a particular issue that you mentioned, national security. Of course, I couldn't agree more that this particular sector or issue certainly is more government than non-government. But we can no longer deny that most of the issues on national security somehow spills over, or if not even, very much also a developmental issue. If we look at it from that particular perspective as a developmental issue, then definitely it calls for more participation on the part of non-government organizations and or civil society. And as I've said, in the Philippines, I'd like to think that at the national level, civil society participation has become really advanced, and our policymakers, while not necessarily listening entirely and only to non-governmental organizations, they can't deny them at the very least a space for them to express what they have to say. Now, as to the question how to further improve this, if there is a way to link non-government organizations' participation at the local level and participation at the national level, then that could be more potent, Dr. Bhusal. At least there will be some way to link what's actually happening on the ground, and use it as basis for policymaking at the national level. I'm sure you will agree that the way things are at the local level or even at the state level is significantly different compared to how it is seen at the national level. Hence, there is really a need to connect the dynamics at the local, at the state, and at the national level.
Absolutely, I fully agree with you. Why not? So the point there now emerges, Professor Tayao, is that many local governments, if we are talking or focusing our conversation at the local level, is that the regulatory aspects of how local governments actually utilize, if that is the right expression, the existence of civil society organization in the making of certain policy areas, as we highlighted in our previous topic. So funding comes there because many local governments are prone to fund or not to fund civil society or non-governmental organizations for some reasons. We have some evidence from some countries that local governments are actually prohibiting a certain type of, I'm not saying, I'm not generalizing, but certain type of civil society or non-governmental actors to get into the decision-making processes. So considering your own experience in, let's say, writing the draft proposal for the amendment of the Philippines Constitution, what would be your observation about how should the local governments, if that is our focus here today, regulate those civil society organizations in a way that they can facilitate the voices of ordinary people from the very grassroots to the decision-making processes at the local level?
Actually, Dr. Bhusal, what's happening in the Philippines is quite the other way around. Regulation has started before non-government organizations at the local level can even develop as that in the national level. Of course, it's a mix of developed non-government organizations in different local governments. But as I've mentioned, because the dominant political power is still very much on political families, we have a very, what's this, a clientelistic or a patron-client type of politics in the Philippines. I'm sure, of course, you're very much familiar with developing country politics. And so this kind of politics has significantly weakened the independence of public institutions. Hence, in terms of regulation or regulatory functions at the local level, it becomes more of control than regulation. As for the funding, of course, of non-government organizations have been significantly affected, more by the lack of international assistance now making its way in the Philippines. I'm not sure really whether this is because of limitations because of the pandemic, or perhaps because of official limitations on the part of the national government, considering its broader foreign policy framework. So in that regard, I'd like to emphasize that funding non-government organizations is very much limited to private funding in the Philippines. And we don't expect much from the local government units themselves or the government themselves unless non-government organizations are tapped as some kind of consulting organization or a partner organization in either policy formulation or implementation.
Absolutely, yes, Professor Tayo. Then comes the issue of capacity when we talk about funding or regulating the non-governmental actors in certain policy areas and so forth. So when we talk about capacity issues, my reading suggests that there are at least three different dimensions of capacity which we need to take into account while discussing about the participation of non-governmental actors in the decision-making processes, both in the unitary system of government and also in federal or semi-federal settings. The first dimension is of the individual capacity. So to what extent governments of different types or government of interest or in context can actually help empower individual citizens to get into the process and have their say or influence the decision-making processes is one aspect. That's the capacity of individuals who would like to participate or not like to participate in the process. Then comes the capacity of civil society organizations or non-governmental organizations that we are talking today. Many civil society organizations lack the expertise on certain policy areas, but they tend to influence the decision-making makers in a way that the entire processes should be more participative rather than just controlled by certain people. And the third dimension of the capacity relates to the decision-making authorities themselves. So to what extent, for example, certain local governments are equipped with or capable to incorporating views of ordinary citizens in the making of certain decisions. So how would you interpret this capacity issue in terms of, let's say, expanding the spaces for ordinary people? I remember one of the, I'm sorry for taking time, the statement mentioned by Professor Carol Patman, who consistently says since the 1970s, is that when we offer participatory opportunities to people of different types, of course, then the capacity of themselves develops gradually. It does not happen day one, day two, day three. So it goes gradually, and by the end of certain spectrum, they become capable enough in influencing the decision makers. So overall, how would you define the issue of capacity development?
Okay, that's a very comprehensive question, Dr. Bhusal. Let me respond to you also point by point. As to the first aspect that you've mentioned, yeah, I couldn't agree more that the form of government matters significantly. You see, in a unitary framework, the frame of mind is also affected by the framework, mainly because the key assumption in a unitary framework is that everything can be settled, everything can be addressed by the central government or by a unilateral unidirection setting, whether it's in policy making or policy implementation. We're talking of a federal or at the very least a decentralized framework. The frame of mind is therefore that there are competencies that are better expected at different levels and collated at the national level so as policy interventions will be more effective. I also agree that there are non-government organizations which they themselves are also somehow politically oriented, and therefore, despite some limitations in terms of technical capacity, would still insist on participating and engaging formal institutions of government just so that it can or they can influence some policy direction and even implementation. How to improve this in terms of regulation is something that needs to be further studied, mainly because, as I've said, in developing countries, the main challenge is mainly with public institutions. And public institutions are weak And therefore, if we expect non-government organizations to to develop some level of sophistication, I'm inclined to think that the one regulating their activities, which would definitely be public institutions, should be sophisticated themselves. And taking off from what you've mentioned at the latter part, certainly reforms could not happen overnight. And this I've seen also in the experience of decentralization in this country. We introduced the decentralization law in 1991. We started implementing it in 1992. But we saw concrete inroads or concrete achievements only after 10 years, which means in terms of transitioning from a more powerful or a more responsible kind of local governance, one that is more engaged and one that is more autonomous compared to how it was before. It really takes time precisely because in terms of competencies, they have to develop their competencies and even improve their resources following these competencies.
Right, absolutely. You mentioned the issue of political orientation of civil society organizations or non-governmental organizations that actually happens only in the developing world. And this issue is often raised by many development partners who are interested to implement certain programs or projects in developing countries by utilizing the resources of non-governmental actors. What happens then is that the national governments of different layers, of course, tend to claim or blame that certain civil society organizations may have some political rationale behind why they are there, and therefore they are unwilling to include them in the making of certain decisions at certain level of the government. So how can this paradox of politicization of civil society actors and the perception of such politicization on or with the decision makers can be balanced? Can't we have certain, let's say, impression or unbiased view about those political, civil society organizations? How can we think of it?
Thank you for that question, Dr. Bhusal. It's really one, I'd like to think, not only one of the significant, but perhaps the most significant element that we have to consider in terms of development work in different countries. You know, there was an instance where I was asked to be the assessment expert of development engagements in Asia Pacific. And one of the things that I've mentioned to the development partner is that, you know, when a particular project call is formulated, I hope the project call allows leeway for non-government organizations to make an assessment first before they can develop the policy engagement or an intervention to whichever level of government, whether local, national, or state government. I say this because almost always in terms of assessing project proposals and enable for non-government organizations to win bids as propounded by development organizations. One particular element that they always insist is political participation, which is good, except that political participation should be viewed not on its own, but as we have been discussing at the outset, should be looked at in terms of how it enhances other aspects of governance. It cannot just be one element that should be demanded, not in the local, not in the state, or not at the national level, mainly because when we speak of political participation, there should be a key objective in mind. And again, as I've said, the context is very significant in this regard. in that it should take into account the different settings and characteristics of politics at different communities. So the answer to that question, Dr. Bhusal, which I'm sure you might have encountered already in your years of work with developing countries, is to make policy proposals and project calls more comprehensive and not only rated or judged on the basis of elements which do not really jive at all.
True, absolutely. So we both of us agreed upon the reality that there must be the presence of non-governmental or civil society organizations in the making of certain public policies, either at the federal, provincial, or local level, given that its national context should allow them to be present at different levels. Now, I would like to finally ask you, Professor Tayao, about your recommendation to those countries who would like to introduce some robust mechanisms so that their policy making can be more participatory in terms of how civil society organizations or NGOs can actually facilitate the participation of ordinary people in the making of certain decisions.
Okay. The way we proceeded in the Philippines is that we realize that it is not right to just say federalism is working in, say, Germany or working in Argentina or in India, and therefore we should copy it and adopt it in the Philippines. No, every country is a particular, a distinct, a unique model in itself of a federal or a unitary or a decentralized form of government. So we proceeded by way of making sense of the kind of politics that we currently have, looked at it in the from the perspective of political history, how it has been in some years back, and identifying the key challenges that we're facing, so that if we design the kind of structure, the kind of political system that we think would really fit the context, can address these problems that we have identified that the country faces. More often than not, when we speak of reforms, Dr. Bhusal, I'm sure you also encountered that there are some development organizations that would insist that they know how to address local challenges, which is okay, except that, again, as I've said, what worked in other countries can only serve more as a reference and should be taken more in terms of contributing to addressing particular or unique issues at the local level. So how to move forward really is to understand more and deeply and comprehensively the problems that are faced by a particular country before particular reforms can be introduced. Last but not the least, it should be understood that when policies are made, it should really be made comprehensive, but at the same time, specific enough to allow effective implementation. In the Philippines, our experience is that, especially if we look at our constitution, some of the provisions are open-ended, which always end with the phrase "as may be provided by law." I'm not a lawyer, but any lawyer that you are going to speak of that I have been engaging with for so many years would always tell me that it only means that it's still dependent on Congress how to actually implement it. In the end, what happens is, even if it is already provided in the Constitution, if Congress does not come up with policies to implement it, it cannot be implemented. So again, we have to be very specific in looking at and identifying the key problems, and then we design institutions, systems, public institutions and systems in order to address these problems.
Okay, and Professor Tayao, thank you very much for your time today with your expert involvement in this conversation. we tried capturing many of the dimensions of how different layers of government in the making of certain decisions can actually incorporate non-governmental actors or civil society organizations over there. We talked more about how local level government is specifically relevant to this context, and we also discussed about how certain policy areas can be more restrictive or not that much favorable for the participation of non-governmental actors, while others are more. We also discussed about some regulatory aspects, including the funding and others related issues over there. And then we came to talking about the capacity related issues, which I think was this center point of our today's discussion. We captured different dimensions of how capacity actually makes or hinders the participatory processes in the making of decision making. And we also very interestingly cast up on some of the politicization aspects of non-governmental actors in the making of decisions, and how that politicization can actually make some conclusions or consequences about the perception of decision makers at different levels. Thank you. With this summary of our topics today, I would like to thank you, Professor Tayao, for your time. And I'm thankful to Hans Seidel Foundation in India for trusting me to convene these conversations. And with these words, I would like to commit that I will be coming with next discussion points in the forthcoming weeks or so. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bhusal. It's been a pleasure, and it's an honor to participate in these discussions. Also, many thanks to Hans Seidel Foundation for your support.